And thank you so much for coming. And I really would like to thank the Mittal Institute actually here. I would like to thank my two superstars actually, Naomi and Loretta here. I'd like to thank Hitesh, Carlin, Salmon, Daniel, who else I'm missing? Yeah, of course, yeah. And my colleagues as well at the Mittal Institute here. So what I'm going to speak today is part of my ongoing work, which is like a book project, which I am kind of thinking to finish that by the end of the fellowship here at Harvard. So this is work in progress, and this must be the first time that I'm presenting it here actually to an outside audience. Yeah. So, all right. What is different about climate justice in South Asia, caste, the Adivasi question, and climate change in India? Globally, climate justice has emerged as a major framework acknowledging the disproportionate burden experienced by the countries and communities in the least responsible for the anthropogenic climate change. However, climate justice within countries that are most unequal societies in the world, such as India, has not yet gained enough attention in the climate change scholarship and in policy. In this presentation, I'm going to look at climate justice within India, considering caste and the Adivasi question as two central socio-ecological hierarchies in the subcontinent. Based on my fieldwork that I conducted among the Adivasi and Dalit farmers in the world's largest area of mangroves forests in the Bay of Bengal in the Sundarbans and the Kuttanad Delta region in South India, I highlights the limits of the universal frameworks of climate justice in regions like South Asia. I demonstrate how unique forms of injustice, inequalities, and their multiple intersections and intertwined socio-economic relations determine and mediate the experience of climate change in India. I finally sort of argue that in regions like South Asia might need alternative climate justice framework, climate justice mitigation, and climate change adaptation policies informed by these complexities. So I'll be talking about my two locations in detail in the later parts. Now, thinking about first in terms of looking at climate change in India. So in thinking about what is going on globally, the scientific evidence is unequal that the climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So it's from the IPCC actually, one of the co-chairs of the IPCC's recent statement in that sense, who kind of put that out for the world in clear that how science, unlike the last couple of decades where we have had doubts about science of climate change in that sense. Now, what is going on in regions like South Asia or India specifically as part of these global changes? In line with the estimates made by the IPCC, NASA, based on the observations from more than 1,000 meteorological stations for the past 120 years, data recorded by the India's Meteorological Department, the all India annual mean surface temperature has increased by 0.6 degrees Celsius during the period from 901 to 2010. The sea surface temperature in the oceans around India has risen by 0.6 percentage, with largest observed increase around the equatorial Indian Ocean. Now, according to the Ministry of Earth Sciences of the Government of India, the average temperature in India has risen by around 0.7 degrees Celsius between 1901 and 2018. Based on their estimates, projected a rise of 4.4 degrees Celsius and the intensity of heat waves to increase by 3 to 4 times by the end of the century. Now, I'm not talking about a longer term. This can be in the lifetime of maybe like Zara in that sense, for example, here that we are talking about. Now, according to the India's Ministry of Earth Sciences and the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology, between 74 and 2004, the mean sea level in the northern Indian Ocean have risen by 1.6 to 1.75 millimeter per year. And this was 3.3 millimeter per year from 93 to 2017, which means the intensity of rise is increasing as the time is moving in that sense, So I hope some of those things you can see there. Now, the Himalayan region of India is home for some of the most important glaciers spread across in the Union Territory, Ladakh, and the state of Jammu and Kashmir, Sikkim, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Arunachal Pradesh. Now, in the Indian Himalayas, small glaciers have been retreating rapidly. In the Chenab Basin of Himachal Pradesh, the area of small glaciers have been decreased by 38% during the period of 1962 to 2004, while the area of large glaciers has decreased by 12% in the same period, actually. Now, of course, I'm not boring or frightening by talking about some of these statistics and data. Now, one thing that you might notice that I'm talking about the official data by most of the government Government of India, organizations the Ministry of Earth Sciences in that sense. So on to kind of even try and see what is the degree of change that has been demonstrated by even the most conservative state estimates in that sense, or the state organizations in that sense. Now, if you kind of look at some of the general estimates otherwise, by let's say by NASA, or number of research that are conducted both here in the US as well as in parts of Europe, things are quite bad in that sense, much worse than this. Okay, so so there is no state in India where extreme weather events due to climate change did not reported. However, in certain states such as Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Assam, Bihar, Kerala, Maharashtra had higher number of human mortality out of extreme weather events, and only between 1917 to 2019, as many as 1.5 million people died out of heat waves, cold waves, floods, lightning, and tropical cyclones. What happened last year in 2022? in 2022, every day in India had an extreme weather event that claimed around 3,000 people actually, and affected 1.8 million hectares of crop area, destroyed over, thousands of houses, and killed a huge number of livestock. Now, this estimates is again like though like this has been like highlighted as an annual estimate. This calculation is only for like 9 months actually. So one thing is clear, that the global climate change is regionally seriously impacting regions like India, and we do have very substantial scientific evidence for that. Now, like one of the statements that I kind of use, you can read from that the Ministry of Earth Sciences of the government of India says that the India has witnessed a rise in average temperature, a decrease in the monsoon precipitations, a rise in extreme temperature, rainfall events, droughts, sea level rise, and increase in the intensity of severe cyclones, along with other changes in the monsoon systems. So now I briefly want to get into the question of climate justice in that sense, like broadly to speak. Now, like most of us are aware about what is climate justice and how like the questions of climate justice kind of started evolving both globally as well as regionally in that sense. And in that history, India do have an important role to play in that sense of thinking about, like, for example, I'm talking about the publication by Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal, which kind of shows that, what are the super complexities in that sense to look at or kind of argue for global as well as regional climate change in that sense. Climate justice in that sense. Now, climate justice has, of course, like multiple layers in that: international climate justice, intergenerational, domestic justice, environmental justice, ecological justice, like non-human and non-living. Now, there has been inter and cross-disciplinary literature that kind of addressed most of these regionally and globally. So my work sort of kind of located within this, in specifically thinking about South Asia and India. Now, in India, in 2007, the Greenpeace India's Hiding Behind the Poor, like one of the reports which was like titled Hiding Behind the Poor, suggests that the considerably significant carbon footprint of a relatively small wealthy class of 1% of the India's population was camouflaged by 823 million poor population in the country. Now, we do have like multiple estimates, multiple calculations, which came even like after that kind of like substantially show that how and why we do have substantial evidences for carbon emission differentials in India, and how a minuscule like minority of India that is mostly kind of populated in major cities in the country kind of have this sort of substantial amount of carbon emissions that is sort of camouflage in that sense. So like I have like number of these estimates. Now, one of the last one is a report which came out in February 23 actually, which kind of again show that how this inequality kind of like openly exists in countries like India. Of course, it's not only the like story of India. We would see this like elsewhere in the world in that sense, which I would like talk about like later if like any of you are interested. So I want to quickly now jump into the questions that I'm going to like focus more on, which is caste, like one of which is, of course. Now, caste is, of course, is a quite complicated, messy, highly politically loaded in that sense to kind of even start thinking about or to kind of like talk about in that sense. So there is a religious history of caste now that does not like restrict like caste only into Hinduism in that sense, but of course you would find like caste among Muslims, among Sikhs, among Christians, among Buddhists in that sense. Yeah. So we do have a very longer history of one of the very sophisticated systems of exploitation in that sense in most part of like South Asia, in India, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, and in Bangladesh, and also like of course, diasporas again. So I just want to show. I just want to note a couple of things here that now for an audience who are not like much like familiar with caste in that sense, like it's going to be like a much detailed like discussion or an education in that sense, which would require, which I'm not going to do here, which of course I can engage with maybe like after my presentation in that sense. So what I want to note here is that how do we have like something called caste system, and how that is integral in the way in which how or societies or economies or genders or ecologies are organized in that sense. Now, this is what it kind of like look like. Of course, it's again quite complicated, quite messy regionally in that sense to think about, of course, but roughly, of course, look like this, where you have higher to low power in that sense as up to the pyramid. And what I want to note here are two sections of communities who are Adivasis, or the indigenous people of India. Like in India does not call the Adivasis as indigenous people, which has like different like legal as well as other reasons in that sense, which I can talk about later. So both Adivasis and Dalits are located outside of the caste system in that sense, who are not part of the Varna system. Now, what is the environmental relations that the caste do have? Now, in general, or to broadly speak, the caste determines and mediate ecological or the environmental relations in South Asia. Now, thinking about the scholarship on the environmental history of India, we do have a comparatively rich as well as vibrant environmental history scholarship in that sense, which kind of like look at the ways in which in that sense how like both the physical environment in that sense and again the human environment have kind of evolved historically, also looking at in the pre-colonial periods and in the post-colonial periods. So now the caste actually as an ecological question did not get so much attention in that vibrant history of environmental history and writing on environment in India and in South Asia. Now, these relations were understood as eco-casteism as well as environmental casteism, as how caste get rationalized, or the caste system get rationalized and justified through nature by the dominant caste, and then how any rupture against these orders get framed as against nature or the natural order or the so-called natural order, which is caste. So even without events of climate change, the evidences suggest that how Dalit communities, how Adivasis and other backward caste groups are vulnerable during natural disasters, in recovering from it, in relief from the state. So historically, we do have like some of these very well documented in the post tsunami in the state of like Tamil Nadu, as well as post Bihar floods. In that sense, like floods in Bihar is like something which occur like frequently, like every year. So like some of these things are quite well documented in that sense, that how do these communities disproportionately get impacted from floods, from from even like state relief in that sense, in the case of tsunami in Tamil Nadu. Now, newer emerging research suggests the vulnerability of Dalit, Adivasis and other backward caste groups, and the urban poor and farmers, fishing communities in the country. Now, I'm going to talk about two places. One of them is this place called Kuttanad in Kerala. Those of you who have gone to Kerala as a tourist most likely have gone to this particular district called Alleppey, where you might have like taken a houseboat or a boat or some other means of like transport, where you kind of like navigate through some of these locations that I'm going to talk about. This is the Kuttanad region. In that sense, you can see like India, you can see Kerala kind of like marked in like South India, and in Kerala's map you can see in south of Kerala I have mapped the region called Kuttanad. Now in August 2019, how am I doing in terms of like time?
You should do like halfway through.
In August 2018, the state of Kerala received an extended period of very heavy rainfall as a result of low pressure system near the beginning of the month. As per IMD, Kerala received a rainfall that is highest rainfall in the last 87 years, actually, in 2018. Now, this resulted massive flood, killing over 400 people and displaced 1 million more, with a huge economic cost. Now, some of you like must have seen the pictures of Kerala flood, like those of you were following the media and news in that sense at that time. What was the kind of like devastation in this particular state of like South India had undergone? Now, this is a picture from NASA, which recorded the location that I'm like talking about, called Kuttanad in that sense, both before and after floods. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about what is the socio-demography of this particular region that I'm going to focus on. Kuttanad has similar caste structure found elsewhere in the state, Kerala. There are like Nambudiris or Brahmins who are considered to be at the top of the hierarchy, which I was talking about. I was like showing you the pyramid. And then there are Nayars who are considered to be next, followed by Yedavas and the Pulayas and Parayas are the ex-untouchable communities. Among Christians, there are Syrian Christian communities who consider themselves as higher caste Christians. And then you have Dalit Christians. The former untouchable communities who are converted into Christianity. Among Muslims, there are only backward caste Muslims in this region. Now, Dalit communities in this particular region comes from caste called Hulaya as well as Paraya, and Dalit Christians who are found in most part of like smaller region like Aramandu, like name all of them now, which I will be like talking about sometime like later. So like that was for you to kind of get a sense of the ways in which how, like socioecologies are kind of structured in this particular region. Now, there are a few things which is quite striking or unique about this particular region. Now, Kuttanad is a low-lying region in the state of Kerala, spread across Alappuzha, Kottayam, Pathanamthitta districts in the southern part of the state. The area is spread quite huge as the only region where paddy is cultivated between 1 meter to 2 meter below the sea levels in the wetlands formed by draining delta swamps. This is also one of the food and agriculture organizations, globally important agricultural heritage system. Now, you might see this in some other part of the world, for example, in like Southeast Asian countries in that sense, like some of the like similar agrarian practices have kind of evolved over centuries. Now, this evolved for more than a century by a system of fresh and saline water flow in the region through Vembanad Lake. Now, like Vembanad Lake would be the lake that, like those of you have gone to Alleppey, like must have kind of like navigated in that sense, or your houseboat must have been in this particular lake. That receives 5 rivers: Pamba, Hachankovil, Meenachil, Manimala, Muvatupura, and the inflow of saline water from the Arabian Sea. The inflow of salt water is regulated by the Tannirmukkam salt barrage in the north, and in the south, the Thotapalli spillway that help the outflow of salt water. Now, I'm not sure if you can see those outflow of the water as well as inflow. This is the point, right?
Oh, no, the bottom one.
This one. So somewhere here you would see those both in that sense. Okay. So I think here you can't see it much. Most part of Kuttanad is usually flooded every year, given the low-lying nature of the region. Now, Dalit colonies. Now, colony is a Malayalam word in that sense here, which is mostly used for Dalit ghettos in that sense, where other regional languages, like for example in Marathi, you would probably call it as Maharwada. In Andhra Pradesh, you would call it as like there are names for that. I'm not like we calling it anyway. So Dalit colonies and other lower caste families mostly live on the edges of water and paddy fields that were historically made cultivable using Dalit laborers who were brought in this particular region as slave laborers historically. Okay. Now, when do we call flood a flood? The perennial floods that I was talking about, that happens every year here, like more or less, are mostly affected in the regions that are most low-lying, where Dalit and lower caste communities are concentrated. Hence, Dalit colonies are mostly flooded every year, but that is not considered as the so-called real flood in that sense. This is like one of the pictures. This is not my picture, and this might be the only picture which is not mine. Yeah. So, my interlocutors in that sense in Kuttanad, that includes women, children, old people, workers, who are like mostly dependent on like agriculture or like daily wage agriculture work, kind of like talk about what was like their experience of like undergoing this particular flood in that sense. So I kind of quote like some parts of what they kind of like talk about their own experiences. We always had floods in Kutanad. Most of these places where we live get flooded every year. We manage that on a regular basis. And we have lived with that here, though we may have like minor losses out of those floods or shift temporarily to other locations or to relatives elsewhere for a few days. These kinds of floods aren't really considered as floods. So I'm not going to read them like entirely, which kind of shit like says that how we do have like experience of flood in this particular region. But what changes in this particular flood in the 2018 is that this was something which was unprecedented, which was like something that they have like never seen in this particular part. We haven't witnessed something like that ever before. It was certainly something new and really devastating. The regions that always get flooded otherwise are the most low-lying areas, and mostly people from our communities live in these kinds of locations. Hence, the big floods, we were the first to get affected and the last one to recover from these. Everyone had to live in camps. Now, camps are like mostly state-built like shelters, like temporary like shelters in that sense. During the floods until the water receded, of course, life was difficult during those days. The cooking in our camp was done by some people from our community, and they were people who refused to eat from what was cooked there. They did not want to eat from the food cooked by us. Some of them said that they are pulayas and we can't eat what they cooked. There were also people who were reluctant to live in the camps where everyone was living together. They found it difficult to live with us even during a disaster like this. This is a bunch of news actually, which I kind of like collated in the way in which how do people experience like openly caste. Now, these are like mainstream Indian English media in that sense, like NDTV, you know, some of those kind of like reported this, that, you know, how we have had rampant caste discrimination, both during and in the aftermath of floods in the state of Kerala. Now, I'm talking about Kerala, that is also like traditionally kind of highlighted as like one of the progressive states in that sense, in terms of the socioeconomic and other development indicators in that sense. Now, moving from current location, now one of the ways in which how people are like managing with this is moving from this particular part of the state. Families are moving, abandoning their houses after 2018 and the 29 floods. Official estimates suggest that more than 10 lakh families have already either abandoned their houses or moved from these locations where it has become uninhabitable in the Kutanad region. Now, people do talk about how it is impossible for people to live in this particular region, also because the ways in which how like you don't have like money in that sense to move, or to like moving from a place is not like an easy business in that sense. Okay, I'm not reading that out. So if you like just want to see it. Now I'm jumping to my second location, which is Sundarbans in the West Bengal. Now you can see Sundarbans is located in the Bay of Bengal. You can see like Sundarban marked in the Indian map there. You have a particular part of Sundarban again that I kind of shown for those of you who don't know this particular region. This is what the India-Bangladesh border of the region look like. You have somewhere here India and and Bangladesh, of course. Okay. Now, this is the particular island where I conducted my field work for this. Now, this might look like if it's an island or not, actually. Yeah, from the like Google map in that sense. Now, Sundarban is, of course, like most of you have heard about this particular region in that sense. Is a mangrove forested delta formed by the confluence of Patma, Brahmaputra, Meghna rivers in the Bay of Bengal. Couple of things about Sundarban. Sundarban is considered as the world's largest mangrove forest areas. Now, this is also one of the UNESCO's World Heritage Site in that sense. And a couple of things about this particular region. Why this great importance is like also because of the Royal Bengal tigers that you must have seen, as you know. And then, like, of course, this particular, like, couple of other species like Eustine crocodiles, as well as the Indian python. So Sundarban is also categorized as endangered by the International Union of Conservation of Nature in that sense. You, like, I don't know, like how many of you are like familiar about these categorization in that sense by this particular organization. Now, Sundarban is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. You might find mention about this particular region in most of the IPCC reports in that sense, like frequently kind of like talking about. Now, Sundarban mangrove has substantially shrunk in that sense from the time in which like scientists have started thinking about the degree of change in this particular region. Now, you have like sea level rising in that sense. You have, you know, this region as one of the most impacted by devastating cyclones every year. Okay, so like you can see some of those, the names of like cyclones there, and how the IMD is kind of like categorized this particular region as one of the most, the like cyclone capital of India in that sense is called this particular region. Now, the communities that I'm going to talk about are the Adivasis, or the indigenous communities in this particular part of India. Now, the districts where the Indian Sundarbans are located are South 24 Parganas as well as the North 24 Pargana districts that share the Indian Sundarbans, which has a population of around 25 million in the state of like West Bengal. Now, I'm not going to like talk about the caste structure in this particular state. Also, like considering the time, which I can like come back to in the question answers session. Now, in this, like tribal communities or the Adivasis share are 10% of the total population, in which we have Sandal tribal communities as well as Orao, Munda, and Bhumij group. These are like particular like names of the Adivasi communities Now, this is what my interlocutors in this particular region kind of like substantially kind of like talk about what is their experience in that sense in dealing with impacts of changing climate. Now, I want to read this out. As Adivasis, we have less support mechanisms from the state, and any help reaches us at the end. What has happened over the past decade is that the land we cultivated has become uncultivable due to salt water or are underwater. Many of our men then started moving out, looking for jobs in the other states. We sell prawns, catch fish, collect crabs, mussels, and sell them. This work requires us to remain in the water for many hours as the water has become salty. It affects our bodies. Lives have become more precarious where the cyclone continues. Salt water is increasing. Most part of our village has become unlivable. The walls that were made to prevent water get destroyed, and when the water levels go up, the help and the support from the state don't reach us or reach us the last. These are like people whom I was kind of like talking to and like kind of interviewing are both like Santal as well as Orao Adivasi women who like collect mussels and come to the market and like sell them. This is a quite like an interesting picture for me. Actually, this was happening when I was conducting my field work. This is the like celebration of the International Day of the Indigenous People. Actually, now what you see actually, all those water that you see are the water which is like salt water, which has come out of sea level rise. Okay, yeah, this is actually like the central part of their village in that sense. So like most part of the village is underwater most of the time in the year, by the way. I mean, like not in like some months. This is also like, you know, like people whom I've been like interviewing, talking to, who like kind of shows me that, you know, what is the like kind of in this now, like I used to like taste this water in that sense. This is like, you know, this would like taste as similar as like any water in the Bay of Bengal or in the Indian Ocean in that sense for the salt content. These are major parts of the farming regions in the village, as well as, you know, like major core regions of the Adivasi village. This again, like you can see, some houses are like still there, like managing, some houses are gone from there. This is again like the other part of the village where, you know, you have like traditionally some of these things were like constructed to prevent like tidal surge as well as like water coming in. This again like a picture that I thought I would like show you where I was there in seasons like where like those of you who know the like weather in the part of India like Odisha coast or like the West Bengal coast, you would know that, you know, how like things change there like momentarily in that sense. Also, given the nature of this particular region, so these are like farmers who are like going in between like a half an hour to like 1 hour like time in between like rains and storms. Now, climate action plans. So I looked at climate action plans of both the state of Kerala, state of West Bengal. And what I want to conclude from that is these 3 points, which I can read out actually. Now, my analysis of the climate action plan, now we have a longer history of how like climate action plans came to being in the most part of the world through the UNFCCC process and all, which I can talk about later. My analysis of the climate action plans of the state of West Bengal and Kerala demonstrate how inadequate they are to address these complexities which I was talking about. They doesn't address the vulnerability of Dalit, Adivasi, and fishing communities. Most climate action plans in India talk about poverty, how poor, and the women, of course, quite important, might disproportionately get impacted, but then there are no plans to address these complexities in the plan. It's been more than a decade since India released this particular plan that I kind of again show. Like I'm not showing like most part of it, but like some glimpses of that, where how inadequately the kind of like questions that I was talking about has not been properly addressed. by these plans, which otherwise is thought to be or like supposed to kind of address. So like these are climate action plans in that sense, in brief, both the national plan as well as the state plans. Now I sort of conclude there by making a couple of arguments actually. Now the climate vulnerability in India or even part of like South Asia in that sense is unevenly distributed among the social groups in India. Dalits, Adivasis, along with farmers, fishing communities, urban poor, and women among them experience the disproportionate burden of climate change. In the noise about global climate justice within India did not get enough attention. In the context of the experience from the both locations that I was talking about, the experiences of Dalit and Adivasi communities suggest that we need newer framework to understand climate change in South Asia. Being sensitive to these complexities would further help us in adaptation, mitigation, preparedness, rescue, and relocation. Most climate vulnerable regions have substantial populations of Dalit, Adivasis, fishing communities, and other backward class populations. Regions where substantial Dalit, Adivasi, and other backward class populations reside are becoming more unlivable due to climate change. Adaptation is not enough, or there are limits to adaptation. Managed retreat is the managed retreat a way out for India? If it is, how do we address these complexities? How do we integrate these complex questions into the development planning? Climate change preparedness, adaptation, mitigation, and planned retreat is crucial as something called co-benefit, which I can talk about later in that sense, was something quite central to the climate action in India. Now, how do we approach loss and damage in that sense, which got a lot of importance, particularly in the context of post COP27? How do we approach and talk about loss and damage in the context of the progress in the loss and damage finances, which was made in Egypt in that sense? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. Very, very interesting talk. So I'll just ask Asma a few questions, and then I think we'll open up the floor to everybody else. So my first question has to do with some of the conclusions. So what is managed retreat? And is that something that can be applied readily to these issues? Or what is that about? What can you tell us about managed retreat?
Yeah.
You just want to.
Yes. Just fuel around for now, and then we'll get to the rest.
Manage the retreat or the planned retreat, as it as it is called here in the US lexicon, is something called for example, let me use a lighter example here. So we have the business school or the Kennedy School, quite close to the Charles River in that sense. Now, if we know the Charles River is going to flood, we might have to shift both the Kennedy School as well as the business school. Now, how do we do that? Now, we will have to do this in a planned way, where we make a plan in regions that do not flood. So it's quite a huge work in that sense to move populations who live like traditionally in one location to shift them to another location. Now, what is going on, particularly in the US, is that you would know it much better than me. parts of like Miami, they are like planning and like doing this. Now, this is a highly like a process which involved a huge lot of like money in that sense, and that is also one of the reason why I like things like this are going to get like quite complex in that sense, like when it comes to countries like India, where we have or fundamental like questions in that sense of food, or some of those things have like not even like met now. So nevertheless, how do we still think about these communities? Like, are we going to live like all of them for death in that sense, or are we going to, or like leave them to move by themselves, which they are already like doing in that sense? For example, like if you like talk to like migrants in the city like Kolkata, you would find more than half of them in like coming from regions like this. If you like again in like states like, for example, in Bangalore, in Kerala, in like Tamil Nadu, in Pune in that sense, in Mumbai, in Delhi, in like newer parts of like Delhi, like Gurgaon and all, you would find like a lot of like migrants who have come due to like some of these reasons in that sense. So manage like the retreat in that sense is like something quite new for regions like India, which might have to be done in that sense. There are people or like states like thinking about it now. Yeah.
Okay, I'm getting a clearer picture. So these are people already, you talked about people moving, and they're so far they're just moving on their own. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
And so these like 100,000 people are moving because of the floods or the rise in sea level in West Bengal. Okay. I want to say, just to clarify something that you said, while we've seen an overall decrease in monsoon precipitation in the last 50, well, since like 1950s in India, and we think we can begin to explain this. I don't need to go into too much detail about that. Two things. First, we have seen some evidence of an increase in intense precipitation events, in part due to this more water vapor in the atmosphere as sea surface temperature rises. And we expect, in fact, that the slow decrease that we've seen may reverse in the future, and we may get more intense monsoons in the future. So, and more flooding. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how the monsoon will change going forward. At least in the scientific community. What about we talked about was it 2022 when there were very high temperatures? Can you talk more about who was affected by those high temperatures? Was that mostly cities, and more specifically, what kinds of people? If you know what caste,
Actually,
what their social status was.
So in the 2022 heat waves, there is an article in the New York Times actually on it, which was like written by like one of my colleague called Chandini Singh. She kind of like explains that, how she was kind of experiencing that, and how she like document there how like rickshawalas who like pull rickshaws in that sense in the cities like Delhi, Bangalore and all, and also homeless people in that sense, street vendors in that sense. So she kind of like document that how like a vast number of urban poor in that sense, homeless, who were like disproportionately kind of like impacted by these heat waves in that sense in that year. which is like quite an important piece in that sense to read that. So like of course, most of these do impact the most vulnerable people
Wow.
in like of course like most part of the world. But what happens in like countries like India is that you have this as like one of the most poor in that sense, and also the preparedness of the state is also not so much there in most of those times in that sense, which kind of add the vulnerability, or like some of those like for example in 22 Delhi had I think around 50 degrees Celsius in that sense. So we are going to see that. I think this is the month of March again. In the coming week, it's going to be crazy in places like we like already have projections which says that like Delhi might see a 42 in that sense. So these are also like temperature that a normal human body can't like function in that sense. So like again, who the populations who have an AC in that sense, or even like at least a cooler is something that like those of you who have been to like Delhi might be like familiar, or even in that sense, like in Pakistan, like a fan which would cool the atmosphere in that sense and breathe from the water.
Right.
Yeah. So so if you can like afford some of those things, or if you are like located in a building which has an AC now, like if you are not, who are those people who are not able to afford this? Who are those people who have to be in the sun even at like 2 o'clock in that sense, in 50 or 51 or 52 in that sense, for their life and livelihood is something that is the most complex about things in India.
Well, I have many questions, but I don't want to take up too much time. So I think we should open up the floor. And okay, I'm going to just call on people because our leader just walked out of the room. So the woman with the
thanks a lot, Adivasi, for this presentation. My question is, one of the conclusions that you make when we talk about how you mean your frameworks, and all that we have is very outdated and it's not taking into account the impact on the castes and the tribes in the country. I'm unaware of such frameworks, so I wanted to hear from you what could be the examples around the world where there are these existing frameworks that could be adapted or we could be learning.
Should I?
Yes, you.
Yeah. Like, thank you for that, actually. So, I mean, like what happens is that, like we do have a lot of like ways in which how do like, for example, in the US, how do they kind of integrate some of these in their planning in that sense? Like, for example, how like Black communities are like disproportionately affected in like not only in the US, but like elsewhere in that sense. So there is an environmental justice movement in that sense that like not only like raised a lot of questions, but also provided like alternative ways to look at some of these questions actually. So, I mean, now if I break down them into like small examples in that sense, for example, like let's say what is lacking in that sense for these kind of communities are resources in that sense. So our states in India, or the Indian state in that sense, to do a lot of things in that sense to look at, actually map who are the most vulnerable and why are they like vulnerable and what is needed in these kind of like locations, which we don't have. Now, we do have a lot of like resources in that sense to do it quite simply in terms of like expertise. Like, for example, I was part of a team which was part of making into the first city climate action plan for the city of Mumbai in that sense. But then like again, like working with the state or like the like government in that sense is again quite complex because they do have their priorities set, for example, like next election in that sense, or or like industry in that sense. So, so there are like multiple like ways to engage in that sense with like most of these questions, which is again like, though this is like a challenging work, there are like newer people who are like trying to get into this, do this, or like try and see. Now, what is happening is this not only in India, but globally, is that a lot of things are changing as part of climate change, but the climate action, like in terms of like countries and cities, has not moving in that sense. So the communities, like voluntary organizations, and like all of them are now like getting into it to kind of like protect their own communities, like their own groups. Yeah. So like, first of all, you have like various ways to integrate some of these like justice questions in like into the mitigation planning and adaptation planning, that could be well integrated into the development plans as such, actually. Now, like, of course, like we know that how that work in that sense also. So yeah.
Yeah, content, yeah.
Okay.
And maybe just have people introduce themselves as well when they're at breakfast, we get into the room.
Chinese Zada, of Cambridge. I just said a comment actually as well. Very impressive presentation. And it reflects wide research, really. Congratulations. I had a simple question of curiosity for myself, not regarding the material. I saw the word with Dalits, you have categorized the population as low caste Muslims. I was wondering, what do you mean by low caste Muslims in India? I saw that.
Yeah. So what happens? I
You
mean,
can say poor Muslims maybe, but how do you say low caste Muslims?
so I mean, what we have seen in like most part of like South Asia, where we have like Islam in that sense again, like let's say in Bangladesh and India, even in like Pakistan, we do have a caste system that got into these like religions in that sense, for example. So now they are not quite similar as how system work in the Hindu scheme of thinking, but then some sort of like hierarchies have crept into it actually. So like you would find like lower caste Muslims, like Dalit Muslims and upper caste Muslims and all in India. I mean, now to comment on Pakistan, I think I should not do that here because yeah.
You explained it very well.
But in my own reading, like Pakistan is also not an exception in that sense. Like we do have these questions more or less the same in Pakistan as well, which we can like talk about later, of course.
Thank you.
I'm gonna call the woman in the brown sweater and then.
I just want to add like.
Oh, okay, sure.
Pastorna Muslim would be an example of like the most oppressed in the Indian hierarchical structure. So if you just look at caste as a system of hierarchy, then they could be called lower caste.
So Pasmanda is like an umbrella term used for like Muslims who are like who come from like lower caste groups.
The woman in the brown sweater and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Pinar Arsoy. I'm a Neiman Fellow here at Harvard, a journalist.
Thank you.
You showed us a few headlines from Indian media about how these issues are covered. Would you say a bit more about how much awareness there is and how the media is covering climate justice in general in India, and what are the missing points?
Yeah. So, I mean, the coverage of climate change and the climate justice in India, I think.
I'll scroll up. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Now the coverage of, I mean, like I don't know a lot about the media, like first of all to say, but what happens is that you have like local expertise in that sense. Like, for example, some like local persons would say or would make a comment on what is going on locally, which get like reported in that sense. But then like a lot of scientific thinking in that sense, and also like locating these regions in the larger scheme of like what is going on is like something which is missing, I think. But now what is happening is that a lot of new as well as alternative media platforms have come up. They are sort of like much more focusing on some of these questions also, because like, for example, for last, like, let's say for last 5 years or so, you have a much more positive awareness in that sense among communities, and also in the watchdogs like media and in the judiciary, like particularly, though like not in the legislature in that sense. So now media is also like mostly being controlled by the state versions in that sense. So that is like something which you would not see. Like, for example, like Loretta used to ask me like what is going on inside India, like about COP. Like are they discussing these questions like inside, which is not actually. Now, like most of the media coverage during COP is about how much money or what share of loss and finances that countries like India can get, and the versions that are like pushed by the Department of Environment as well as, you know, these kind of like bodies in that sense. So like that sort of like narratives comes into in the mainstream media again. But you have like a stronger alternative media in that sense now that kind of shows. But again, some of them are in English in that sense, like in the regional media, like for example, if you think of in Hindi or other regional like languages, you don't have these vocabularies much. Even like for example, people would talk about cyclone, people would talk about some of those things, but people are not able to like, you know, contextualize it in the larger scheme of like what is going on as part of climate change due to that. Yeah.
Okay, the woman with the fancy.
Thank you so much. My name is Tina Hutch, and I am one of the Dalits here, Caste. And I'm from Jharkhand, not very far from Sundarbans. Jharkhand is a tribal land. So Adivasi Munda tribes is a part of where I have lived, and I speak good languages. My question to you is, what is the purpose of this research that you are doing? You know, what is the end goal? Because I'm here at Harvard, I'm a sustainability fellow, so I work a lot in climate change and justice. So I really want to understand what is the end goal of this paper and how it is going to help the community.
I mean, so like most of my work that I have like done in the past as well, like also like if I talk about like directly in that sense, have had some or the other sort of like policy implications in that sense. So I kind of like really hope some of these questions are like talked about, and some of these questions are kind of addressed in the local planning, in the planning of the state, in the planning of like center in that sense, at least kind of acknowledge that, you know, this is like going on and what can be done about that. And also kind of acknowledge that, you know, like some of these inequalities that do exist. So kind of be honest about it, and then kind of like try and start addressing them is like something that I kind of think about. Now, this is like a part of like what I was like showing today was part of a book project in that sense. So I hope the book would come out sometime. Sometime I have like left Harvard, so that I'm safe.
Sometimes this decade would be good. Yeah.
So the like
I'm Pakistan and currently design planning student at the design school and firstly great presentations. My question is based on your research and understanding and work with stakeholders in India, what do you think is the capacity of the government, the municipalities in India to talk about management? Like it still feels like a very foreign concept, like for South Asia. And like, what is your experience? Like, based on your experience, what do you think? Is that something we can actually talk about in India?
If I might actually add on, my question is basically that question also, I guess, how much of the reticence is one, the relative foreignness of the concept or, lack of familiarity with the concept. And then, yeah, is it a state capacity issue that might cause some of the reticence, or also like, how do these populations feel like that or being discussed, in the manage retreat concept of like, are they reticent? Are they like accepting of the fact that there's nothing that can be done? Or is the idea that we want to fight and like make this area hospitable again? Just getting a sense of if, aside from just the idea of it being an external or not familiar concept, now that it is being discussed, how much of it is not being acted on because of state issue or local pushback?
yeah, well, so I mean, what is going on in India, like specifically, like for example, the departments that deals with like disasters, for example, are overwhelmed by the things that happen now because they don't have like much staff to like deal with like vehicles or like other materials in that sense. So what has happened like over like around a decade is that these like departments that deals with disaster management, like so-called like traditional disaster management, they're overwhelmed with what is like going on now. So they are in a lot of like burden in that sense. So some states are like looking at even thinking of like making like a separate department for climate change losses in that sense, some of those. Now, so that is where the like most of the states are in that sense in like dealing with in these crises. Now, this would like of course need huge resources in that sense, huge planning in that sense. What is going on, where it is going on? Like for example, like Loretta was talking about the forecast in that sense. We have really bleak forecasts actually for the like coming like decades. So now like the priorities of the states, again, the priorities of the governments in that sense, the priorities of the political parties, like so to say, so all those things would like matter eventually, that how this crisis is managed in that sense. Now, in specifically thinking about the managed like retreat, I did think twice about like if I should like talk about it here or not actually. Now, what do we do? I mean, like of course, this is like a foreign concept. This is like something is like developing. I mean, we also have this thing about like foreign things are not like we don't like things which are foreign in like South Asia, like traditionally, which is again like a South Asian, I don't know, or like maybe an Indian thing in that sense. So I'm thinking it as a way in which how do elsewhere in the world people are thinking about it, preparing about it, and planning. Now, if we can't have the planned retreat, can we have some plan for India? Can we have some plan for communities who are like are impacted like this? Like can we have some plan for the huge Indian coast in that sense, both in the like Bay of Bengal as well as in the like Arabian Sea? So these are like mostly poorest of the poor communities who come from like Dalits, Adivasis, other backward caste group, fishing communities, lower caste farmers. So we will have to think about this. Like what do we do? I mean, though we do have like examples of leaving people for dead, I mean, we will have to think about something, some or the other alternative. Now, that is the time when I'm thinking about some plan, if that is managed retreat or something else which we can use, or some South Asian model or an Indian model of a plan. Can we have that? Now, if we have that, how does that look like? Who would make that? Where will that be? Are some of the questions that I kind of often think these days about. So, like, that's what it's like my response about.
Maybe one more question. We'll always discuss over samosas outside as well. But maybe one more question in the room.
Hi, thank you for the question. My name is Caste. I'm from India. I go to NBC. My question is, considering that both Kerala and West Bengal have had communist government, one would intuitively think that there have been social safety nets, or there are social safety nets, or any caste-specific schemes. So did you find any evidence of it, or did you find any remnants of these schemes having been carried out in the past, and now, people are reaping perhaps some benefits, as opposed to like a counterfactual of, I don't know, Odisha or Maharashtra?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like I was expecting like a similar question from like somebody who would like naturally could think that, the peculiarity of these like two states in that sense, of course. So my answer to this is this, that, now thinking about Kerala, like, of course, we have this like celebrated Kerala model of development, which I was taught to when I moved from Kerala to Mumbai for my higher studies, actually. Okay. So anyway, so now Kerala, of course, I mean, like, I don't know if it's like my own bias in that sense to kind of think about, is like comparatively like much better in terms of thinking about women, as well as, I mean, like, I would not say so much about their treatment of both Adivasis as well as like Dalit communities in that sense. Like for example, in 2022, Kerala brought out a new climate action plan, actually, which I was looking at very detailed in that sense, which kind of like demonstrate a lot of improvements in that sense, that what they have learned in the past, like, let's say maybe like a decade. Now, social security nets, safety nets, some of them are like, of course, comparatively better in Kerala. Like, for example, we have like something called Kudumbashree. I don't know how many of you have heard about this. Like, it's like a women poverty alleviation / empowerment program in that sense. Like, for example, during the floods in that sense, Kudumbashree was quite active. And this was like one of the state structure that they could kind of use. Now, commenting about West Bengal is quite a complex case, both thinking historically about socially, and also, I mean, West Bengal is quite an interesting case for me as well, because that has like, more than 65% of the West Bengal population are only Dalits and Adivasis, as well as other backward caste communities. And now, if we look at some of the development indicators of these communities, that's one of the lowest in the country. Now, we have had, like consecutive left like rule in that sense in this particular state. So in the West Bengal, in terms of plan, they don't have so much actually. But in terms of thinking about it a little prior, West Bengal was a little ahead. Also because I think because of the experience from Sundarban and how they started it, for example, because like cyclones started to hit in Sundarbans like much before we all started thinking about climate change. So they were thinking, like, for example, like, I don't have those pictures here where this big huge cyclone shelters were built in the state, which I don't think any other states in the country has. So you have like complex like systems exist in that sense. Now, commenting about the tribal communities in the West Bengal, this is also not the traditional communities who kind of like survived there. So you also have like a colonial history where like a lot of these laborers were, as like she was talking about how they were brought from those states to kind of clear this forest, and they like continue to like live there. But what we have in terms of like evidences, similarly, this has been kind of observed that, like, at least if not in research as such, but a lot of journalistic evidences also shows like similar trends in that sense. Like, for example, I don't know how many of you have seen this P. Sainath's Pari, People's Archives of Rural India. They had recently, not recently, like a couple of years back, won some like award on their coverage for climate change in that sense. Now, most of the stories were the similar stories that I was talking about, but then they don't use like words like Adivasi or Dalits and all. They think in terms of like farmer or poor in that sense.